Hey, good night, everyone. My name is Devon Carter, and I'm the Dean of the Anguilla National Youth Ambassador Corps. And tonight we have an open mic youth forum, Voices for Progress, with Minister Deanne Kentish Rogers on the decriminalization of cannabis. So today is an opportunity for young persons and community members to ask questions to clarify any queries that you might have about the new policy that may be coming in place in the next few days. So we're going to start with a word of prayer by Tashawn Gums.
Good evening. Dear Father in heaven, we thank you for bringing us here today. Safe and sound, we pray for a productive and fruitful discussion filled with insights and clarity. We pray that we leave here with more answers and questions, and this poses the forefront of the way forward for Anguilla and the youth at large. In God's name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you for that, Tashawn. So let me just give a quick overview, a little bit about the policy before handing it off to Deanne to say something. As of December 1st, 2024, any person found in simple possession of 10 grams and under of marijuana will no longer be criminally prosecuted. As part of the sensitization, education, and awareness program around the polluted decriminalization of cannabis, the Ministry of Social Development and Education will be publishing frequently asked questions in the run-up to the effective launch date. So please stay tuned and get more information about it. So this is an opportunity for young persons to get more information. I will hand it over to Deanne just in case she wants to say anything before we get into the questioning.
Okay. Hopefully I'm coming through clear. Lee? I'm coming through clear? Okay. Good evening, everyone who's here, and to those who are listening online. This evening I'm hoping to have an open conversation. I'll project my voice with everyone here about the proposed decriminalization of cannabis. And I first and foremost want to thank the National Youth Ambassadors for organizing this open mic. This is where you guys shine, kind of taking up issues and bringing them directly to young people, organizing, venue, everything. So I want to thank you guys for that. I want to thank the proprietors of Waves for allowing us to use this venue for this open mic session this evening. Of course, I'm sure everybody is on their seat trying to find out about decrim, so I'll go into a little bit into detail about the why behind decriminalization. For a very long time, decriminalization was seen as taboo everywhere in the world. And that's partially because of the International Treaty on Narcotics, which put cannabis and a number of other drugs as Class A, B, and C drugs. They were controlled substances. And all of those drugs that fall within those classes would be illegal to both supply and for use in equal measure. We would have seen that international treaty would have come on stream as a result of the opium wars. And I don't know how many of you are aware of the opium wars, but the opium wars is really what started the International Treaty on Narcotics and gradually the international and global approach to controlling drugs and these substances. There isn't a lot of clear information as to why cannabis was scheduled as a Class A substance, but that is the reality within which we operate. And so what has happened over the years is that a lot of evidence has come out, both from cultural, religious, medicinal, and otherwise perspectives about the usefulness, or if I can put it otherwise, the positivity about using and scheduling cannabis as a Class A substance. And that is specifically because when they examine the harms across the various substances. There is a lot of data that looks at what are the harms associated with different types of substances. Cannabis is a lot further down the harm list than substances we use on a daily basis, like alcohol and things of that nature. Nevertheless, even though it may come down the list much further, there are still harms associated with it, specifically in much younger persons. There is evidence that suggests there is some form of negative impact to brain development in very, very early use. And so the international approach has shifted somewhat to actually encourage countries and states to decriminalize. And a lot of the last, I actually had the benefit of attending a UN sitting on narcotics and cannabis very recently, and the very common and consistent call across states is that you should decriminalize cannabis. So that forms a little bit of an overarching background of what we're looking at right now from the global picture, and then we'll get into where we are in Anguilla tonight. Yeah?
All right, thank you. So the first question that we will have, just to start the ball rolling, is what is decriminalization and how does it differ from legalization?
Yes. Great question. Since the moment we started talking about decriminalization, we noticed that there was a lot of conflation between two terms, decriminalization and legalization. So a lot of persons believe that if you decriminalize, you're legalizing, and vice versa. They are actually two different terms. Part of the reason why there is these two different regimes is because the International Treaty on Narcotics actually makes it illegal for member states who are signatory to the International Convention on Narcotics, as the 1971 convention. It makes it illegal for you to legalize in your various member states. So if everyone here is a country, that's Canada, that's America, Chile, Cuba, Colombia, Estonia, Japan, etc., etc. If you are all signatory to that treaty, it makes it illegal for you to legalize in your various jurisdictions. So what we have seen in certain jurisdictions or certain places is like there have been persons who have come out of the convention, or they've removed themselves from that overarching convention, and therefore they've been able to legalize in their various states. The United States, for instance, is still a signatory at the federal level, but at the state level, they have different rules. So there's a very different picture at the state and the federal level in the US. So when we talk about legalizing, we're talking about both creating an industry from both the importation, exportation, supply of cannabis. That's what they're talking about. They're talking about a regulated industry. So just in the way you have Johnny Walker, which is a company that sells alcohol, you will have, for instance, rules and regulations around that company in terms of the percentage of alcohol in drinks. The type of regulations in the state would make certain requirements, like you need to say the damage to pregnant women. If you pick up a bottle of alcohol, sometimes you'll see on the description, may cause, you shouldn't drink it if you are with child or things of that nature. So all of those things come out of the regulation of the market, right? And that is what legalization is. Legalization is allowing the import, the export, the supply, the use, all of those things fall under legalization. Under decriminalization, the name is actually kind of suggested. Decriminalization is about taking away that criminal sanction, non-enforcement of the criminal sanction. So to be clear, there are two types of decriminalization. There's de jure decriminalization, which relates to a changing of a legal framework or the legislation or the law. And there's de facto decriminalization, which is the non-enforcement of existing laws. So there are two types. That's what they're generally known as. In Anguilla's case right now, what we're talking about, we'll get into what is the specific approach that we're taking here. But that's the main difference. You're looking at the criminal sanctions and how you approach persons specifically with use of marijuana. Decriminalization does not make the supply of cannabis legal. It does not. Nowhere in the world does it make the supply itself legal. Yep.
Any questions from the floor before I ask the next one?
I know we're early on into the questions, but one of my main questions were, or something that has been on my mind for a while, what are the repercussions, if any, for minors in possession of a legalized amount of cannabis?
I'm gonna need to hear it again.
Oh, sorry. What? This has been on my mind for a while, from since we created the open mic. What are the repercussions, if any, for minors in possession of a legalized amount of cannabis?
Good question. So first, it would be decriminalized, so it's still not legalized.
Sorry,
No, that's
decriminalized.
okay. I'm just because I know that that's a lot of people's impression still. So this framework does not apply to persons who are under the age of 18. If you're under the age of 18, if you are found with any quantity of cannabis, it could be 1 gram, it could be 10 grams, it could be 3 grams, it could be 16 grams. If you are found with any quantity, you still have to go through the Child Justice Act. So the Child Justice Act will be triggered, and then you will have to go through the system through the Child Justice Act. And that also includes mandatory drugs counseling. That's the approach. How do we choose 18? Well, 18 was chosen because it kind of matches up with the prohibition on the use of alcohol for minors. That's also 18 and under. The research shows that the research that we've gotten and a lot of the conversations before we've moved to the position of decriminalizing, a lot of the conversations were around age 25. It's very difficult to enforce something for persons age 25 because once you're over 18, then you're technically considered an adult.
And that's all, folks.
There we have it.
Yeah, we set the generator.
So sorry for a short intermission. Short intermission, just to make sure you're listening. I was just wrapping up on the question I was asked, specifically around the concern that many persons have been asking about in relation to how do you treat persons under the age of 18, and why was 18 chosen as the number. So dealing with the second question first is because there's the prohibition on the use of alcohol also is 18, we kind of lined up the prohibition with that prohibition for under 18. The research does say that it should be 25, but there are different opinions about the research. And because you are technically an adult at 18, it is also very difficult to justify the massive departure between the prohibition on alcohol at 18 and cannabis at 25. And then in relation to your question, what happens to persons who are found with any quantity of cannabis who is under the age of 18, and I've made this very, very clear, it doesn't matter what quantity you are found with if you are under the age of 18, that the decriminalization does not apply, in that you still will be diverted through the Child Justice Act. The Child Justice Act will still pick up, and the mandatory drugs counseling will become a part of that intervention. Yeah.
So another question that I was getting a lot of is, what's the difference between this being a policy and legislation?
Okay. So very good question. And that really was what brought us to this point, because we've been trying for 4 years to get to this point, and really trying and I would say failing in some regards, trying and failing in that we really needed to find a balanced approach to it, because in equal parts we know that we want to be able to move towards this particular policy, but we also know that people are concerned about the safeguards. And so we thought that making the massive jump to the legislative change, which we would have required a lot of approval from the UK, etc., would be quite a big jump. We've started with a policy. We drafted a policy in 2021. We thought we had the go-ahead, but then the UK government said the policy on its own cannot achieve the stated intention, the policy that was written by government. There also had to be other parts attached to that policy. And other parts meaning that under Section 37 of the Drugs Prevention of Misuse Act, that's the legal framework that prohibits the use of drugs generally. That gives the governor the power to appoint a drugs advisory council. And so in 2020, at the beginning of 2024, the agreed position was 2023 actually, was that the Drugs Advisory Council would be formulated to make recommendations to the governor in relation to the decriminalization of marijuana. So we had some challenges with the Drugs Advisory Council in that they had some delays in getting up and running, but it was successfully chaired by Dr. Linda Banks. Previously, may his soul rest in peace, Mr. Don Mitchell would have been on the Drugs Advisory Council, and they would have produced a report this year in, I believe, end of July, that would have then set out their recommendations in terms of the framework for decriminalization. So, back to your question, why a policy and not a law? The way it operates under the law is that the governor has the power to change or to make regulations in relation to decriminalization. What we wanted to do was have an informed approach to decriminalization. If we're changing the legal framework, we wanted to have an informed approach. We don't have a lot of data locally in Anguilla to help us assist with creating the research that backs the legislative position. We don't even have a lot of research or data in relation to policy positions because, like anything that is in a quote-unquote black market, it's hidden. You can't really see what is happening. You can't see the use, you can't see who's using, you can't see what are the circumstances. None of that is visible. And so the approach taken was to go with de facto decriminalization, which is looking first and foremost at non-enforcement. And I want to specify that the reason why we look at decriminalization is because having persons criminalized for the use of, rather than the supply, the use of cannabis does not, there's no evidence to suggest it stops the use of cannabis. So the intervention, and this is a global intervention, the criminal law has been used by and large to prevent the supply, the use, the importation, and the export of cannabis and other drugs. It has not been successful. Even with it criminalized, there are still persons who use. There are still persons who export, import, and things of that nature. Mind you, it's dangerous, but there is still use. The issue is that use, whether it's recreational or not, the criminal justice system has been seen across states and countries to have been an ineffective response to use. So if someone comes to you and they're being arrested for the possession of 10 grams of marijuana, they go through the court system that gives them a sentence, they receive a criminal record, and after they get that criminal record and they spend their sentence, they come back into society, a lot of their opportunities are then limited. Their travel opportunities are limited, their educational opportunities are limited, and then the question then becomes, when I cannot get a job for simple possession, what do I then do? What is my impact on society thereafter? And there's enough, I'm sure many persons have stories of persons who simply cannot get a job and therefore they engage in other activities, which we don't necessarily want to encourage. So that's fine.
Oh,
Hi. I just had a question about medicinal use. Like, is there a future plan to incorporate that, like licensing or something like that?
Yes. Medicinal use specifically is one that we are looking at because there are, and you'd be surprised at the demographic of persons who are reaching out and asking me. It's usually older persons who are asking me about medicinal marijuana and cannabis. We are looking at how do we create the framework around medicinal marijuana. Now, notably, with medicinal marijuana comes components of importation. So usually the cannabis related to medicinal use is imported because right now we don't have a regulated industry. So you need a regulated industry internally in Anguilla if you're saying you're not going to import for medicinal use. THC products?
Yeah, would there be a distinction between CBD
Well,
and
that's
THC
all a part
products?
of the conversation. Yeah.
Oh, you answered.
Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
So
It's difficult to hear.
hello.
Hi.
I had a question about rehabilitation and addressing the problem of cannabis use amongst underage children.
Yes.
Because as a person at school currently with underage, you know, people, they're walking around with sunglasses. Why? Their eyes are bloodshot. Why? They've been smoking. You know, and the decriminalization of cannabis, of course, in addition to, you know, encouraging others to indulge in cannabis, of course, it will explode amongst the younger people as well. That's not something I'm saying lightly. Like, it's very naive of me to ignore that can potentially happen. So are there any plans that you have for helping out any of these young people? Because it's kind of sad that we kind of just ignore it when we know that it's happening. We know where they go. Like, this location, it made me laugh, you know, like, what are plans for that?
So as I was just responding a little earlier, there's no decriminalization for persons under the age of 18.
Okay.
So if you are underage, it is not decriminalized. So the current position for persons under the age of 18 maintains. It's only for persons who are above the age of 18 that possession of small quantities is decriminalized. So once you're under the age of 18, what happens is you trigger the provisions of the Child Justice Act. And the Child Justice Act means you're then put before the Child Justice Board, which is our part of our diversionary part of the court system. And then the intervention includes mandatory drug counseling. So that's a part of the regime for persons under the age of 18. Now, one of the things to be mindful of is that what we're looking at is there's use. Everybody knows this. From the time we've been going to school, we've been seeing young people, persons our age, using cannabis. That's been the case since, I don't know, but definitely from the time I had conscience. Nevertheless, the approach is not to liberalize for persons under the age of 18. And the reason why it's not for liberalizing persons under the age is because we still want to be able to have our young people functioning. We still want functioning young people within the system. And if it's used simply as a distraction or a coping mechanism, moreover, so there's a lot of data about the misuse of drugs. So some people use drugs and there's misuse of drugs. There's also misuse of alcohol. And we have seen and heard of cases where there's been misuse of alcohol, even within our younger population. So we want to be able to ensure that while persons know that there is de facto decriminalization for persons over the age of 18, it does not apply to persons under the age of 18. None for persons under 18.
Okay, hi. So you mentioned about the entire cycle that happens when someone gets put into the system for smoking weed. Are there gonna be any public education strategies towards educating around the stigma of like weed use or getting convicted for possession? Because that also has an impact on like their ability to function or give back to society.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, there is the intention of doing public awareness, and part of this policy will include when there's an engagement, material will be handed out, educational material will be handed out. We did this countdown in an effort to kind of stimulate conversation around this. So persons it's not just a matter of you just make it, you want people to be engaging, to be talking about it. There will be people who will disagree as well. Like we already factored in, there are two sides of every coin, and there are two perspectives. We're trying to take a middle approach right now. So we're trying to first and foremost deal with the harm of criminalizing. So I want to put it into context, right? If the laws remain as they are, so let's just say you are any amount you can still be picked up for, irrespective. The harm remains the same. The harm doesn't change. So you're still going to be taking persons and putting them in a system that cannot or does not rehabilitate. It doesn't rehabilitate. The criminal justice system, as much my legal training says that the reason why we have court systems is for rehabilitation, punitive, and restoration. Very, very infrequently does it actually touch and concern rehabilitation. Very infrequently. But, that's all a part of the wider conversation about the criminal justice system itself.
Right.
Get a follow-up?
Thanks. Hi.
Hi.
What do you see as the potential impacts, both positive and negative, of the decriminalization process, and how did you weigh those to come up with a decision to decriminalize?
Okay, so some of the data, one of the negatives is that we don't have enough information about use in Anguilla. That's problematic, for anybody when you're trying to make policies. Usually you want your policies to be driven by data. And Anguilla actually has an endemic problem with data. We have an endemic problem with data. But what in this particular policy, what we had to use is a lot of field research, desk research. So that's data driven from information we catch online or from jurisdictions close by. So in jurisdictions close by, what we would have seen, for instance, we use Antigua a lot because Antigua is pursuing a wider decriminalization and legalization framework. And in our conversations with Antigua, they were like, you still want to give discretion. You still want discretion to be available so that it's not seen as a quote-unquote free-for-all. That's part of it. And then one of the things that the Antigua and Jamaica experience really brought to the light is there should be a balance, because there are equally people who disagree, people who agree. So you want to take baby steps. That's basically what they were advocating for. You take a gradual approach, you build up your understanding, and then you can go to the larger extent of doing things like amending the legislation for supply and things of that nature, and medicinal marijuana. So we're trying to take a more balanced approach, first and foremost focusing on recreational use. So our first approach was recreational use in this circumstance. Yeah.
You've mentioned baby steps quite a bit, so I'm wondering, where do those baby steps lead? As in, where do you see the cap of this going?
Well, the baby steps relate to the fact that we are not, the most extreme is legalization. Right? We do not have, and I said this, I feel like I'm over-repeated myself because I've been saying it for 3 years. We don't have the power in Anguilla to legalize. There is no power. Unless somehow in the next 1, 2, 3, 4 years, Anguilla decides it wants to go independent and therefore withdraw from any conventions that have been applied to it, we don't have the power to go to legalization. However, there is still a more advanced regime. And the more advanced regime still includes things like licensing of the supply for limited purposes. So there are still, under these conventions, little aspects that relate to medical use, medical marijuana use, scientific use, and research purposes. So those 3 aspects in the international convention, there are those 3 aspects which are also considered. And those are more advanced than where we are now. So if you understand that we're here, this is here, legalization is here, there's a gap.
Okay. I had a question. How might the decriminalization affect the current legal system and law enforcement priorities in Anguilla? Sorry, let me repeat. How might the decriminalization affect the current legal system and the law enforcement priorities of Anguilla in Anguilla?
Okay, so a really good example I'd like to give. When we were doing our research on the policy, we looked at a depenalization strategy, like the decrim strategy in the city of Lambeth in the UK. So when they did their non-enforcement, what they found was they were able to divert police resources to more serious crimes. So a lot of the times, specifically in the Caribbean, a lot of our legal systems are clogged with very small cases, and police time, resources, and efforts are front-loaded to these small things when they also have larger issues, larger criminal matters like murders and things of that nature, where they're stretched. We know that no one and no country has unlimited police resources. That's number one. And because we don't have unlimited police resources, that means the police have to basically prioritize what they spend their time investigating and things of that nature. If they prioritize nonviolent offenses or possession, then you'll see a lot of their time will be taken up with those matters. But in that particular research, what they found is because they were able to reprioritize their time to more serious offenses, they were perceived to be more effective. That's one part of it. That's one side of it. So, in relation to the police specifically. But I will share that with the National Youth Council so that you can peruse it yourself and look through the results and speak to your peers about it as well.
Okay. So I know that the difference between legalization and everything that it can impact versus decriminalization. But is there any update, or does anyone know in the government where the UK is at with their policies and their reformation?
Smiling because I'm the UK, I don't believe they have any interest in legalizing. So as our administering power, I can give a direct example. Bermuda has gone much farther than Anguilla in relation to decriminalization, but that is because Bermuda also has a more advanced constitution than Anguilla. So Bermuda is able to make a lot of laws without go through the process without as much UK oversight, quote unquote, but they cannot assent to their own laws. The UK assents to their laws. They were trying to get into the industry making of cannabis, but the UK has prevented them from doing so. So, just to put on record, we still cannot, even if you look at the different status of other overseas territories who have attempted to go there. B.W.I has attempted to go there in terms of medical marijuana. They were stopped. Or the Bermuda has attempted to go there in terms of legalizing the industry specifically for export. So when I spoke to Bermuda's minister, their interest was cultivating an industry where persons could work in and then export the products. They were prevented from doing so. So the UK's position is actually quite clear. They're not interested, and they're not interested in any of their overseas territories in getting to that position. So I know that this is a particular pain point for some persons, because I've spoken to people who are interested in legalization and they have these business plans and business proposals, but it's not something that's in our power. And it would be irresponsible of me to say, yes, it's possible, yes, we'll do it, when I know that it's not. So, yes.
Okay. Are there any plans for a governmental expungement of the previous criminal records associated with cannabis? Or public apology to those that have been previously prosecuted for cannabis use? I'm thinking in particular of the Rastafari community, who has been severely impacted by these draconian laws for merely their sacramental use.
Okay. Yes, there is an intention. We have the Rehabilitation of Offenders Act, which is already drafted. The Rehabilitation of Offenders Act allows both the governor and the government to pursue a regime that allows us to expunge the records of persons specifically for non-violent offenses. So possession of cannabis would be considered a non-violent offense. So those convictions will be spent. Currently, after our 2022, time is warped for me right now. But we passed the Child Justice Act in either 2022 or 2021. And the Child Justice Act basically has in it a baked-in provision specifically related to persons under the age of 18 in relation to their criminal records for non-violent offenses. So they wouldn't be captured in having like a record for non-violent offenses. However, persons who would have been arrested or charged before would still have those records. So that's where the Rehabilitation of Offenders Act comes into place. And that's what we're pursuing in the first quarter of 2025.
Is a public apology?
Yes, as for the Rastafarian community, as you said, I will apologize for them because I feel I understand when I'm speaking to persons in the Rastafarian community. I am not a Rasta, even though I have locks, I'm not a Rasta, but I understand. I understand, and I really do think that they deserve an apology because when you look at in Colombia's case, Colombia, they use a cocoa leaf. The indigenous peoples use the cocoa leaf as part of their religious practices. And when they would have joined the convention, International Convention on Narcotics, what ended up happening was they started to criminalize indigenous people for the use of a religious plant. And they would have eventually had created a exception to come out of the convention, specifically because of the impact on their indigenous peoples. And so in our case, and in the Caribbean specifically, where we know that by and large it is the Rastafarian community who have used cannabis for religious purposes, they have been unjustly, I would say, criminalized for that use, given the fact that it is a religious practice. Yeah.
Okay, so what should we expect to see happen on Monday?
Okay.
Since there's a countdown for Monday, we just want to know what happens.
In relation to decriminalization, I want to be very clear as to the limits around, because this is always where it gets tricky. What are the limits around the policies? So one of the areas that we had quite a lot of debate on is public use of cannabis. A lot of debate. Now, in this particular forum, in this policy, public use is not permitted. Private residential use, that is permitted. Public use, not permitted. So if you specifically relating to persons using on close to churches, I mean, Anguilla is small. Let's also put into frame the fact that Anguilla is small. So you're not very far on any occasion from a church or a school or any institution of that nature. But in this particular instance, public use isn't allowed. Now, as it relates to the engagements, because really and truly, because it's a non-enforcement policy, it means that the primary engagement that you'll be looking at is the engagement between the police and the person who's using, right? So when the police or the police approach someone who's using, because we're using this particular this administrative policy, what would happen is the police may engage you and may say, okay, hey, what's your name? you're using, etc., etc. They'll give you a pamphlet relating to the dangers of use. Now, don't laugh at the. I know some people feel like that's not, but you have to. We have an obligation still to make people, equip people, and make them aware of the dangers, the two sides of the coin. That's part of the public education. So, if you then you get this engagement, one of the changes is in relation to if I see you, or you, and I see you once, I see you twice, and I see you 3 times using cannabis, 10 grams or less. Part of the question that was posed was, do you engage that person every single time? At what point in time do you say, well, X, Y, and Z is, let's just say, you're a repeated user, etc., etc. So there was some difference of opinion on that, but even if they catch you, if they say you are using once or twice or multiple times, that's all captured under the non-enforcement. That's because we recognize that if you're a recreational user, it probably means that you're going to be using it more than once. That's the likelihood.
Okay, so I have this question then. Let's say that the police really want to get somebody, when they find out with under 10 grams, could they overstep the policy with legislation that already exists in court?
So part of the decrim is that if you have, so there's something called like aggravating factors. So let's just say you are approached by someone and someone asks you, are you smoking cannabis, da 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 da, and you then start getting confrontational with the officer. That in and of itself is an aggravational factor. So if you then start to go, quote unquote, to assault the officer, that's an aggravating factor. So you can still, you understand? So let's just say you are found outside the Valley Primary School with under 10 grams of cannabis. You can still be approached by the officer. You can still be picked up. You understand? What? Sorry? Yes, that's part of it. That's how you measure. Go ahead.
So do you believe at all that with the decriminalization of marijuana, you spoke to the use right into violent acts? And at that point,
The what?
you said the usage being promoted to violent acts. So if I use and I confront an officer, that's a shift in my behavior, and I will be taken to prison or be tried fairly. However, what about indirect violent acts? So, for clarity, in the instance where I'm using and I'm frequently being reported, and it results in an impairment in my function at work, and that directly has an impact on
Your work.
my stakeholders, what will be the precautions in that manner? Or even let's dial down to more simplistic terms, it affects my driving. Do you believe?
Well, so remember that the offenses there are offenses that are specifically related to those behaviors. So driving recklessly is an actual offense. Or if you remember, you're not allowed to use in public, so you can't go onto a job using,
But the effects are long lasting.
yeah,
So,
that happens now. Being frank, that happens now. Persons use and they'll go to work or other places, but your employment can also have non-drug use policies, just like they may have non-alcohol use policies. If you come to work drunk, let's just say you come to work drunk, and your employer says, this person is drunk, you can't be interfacing with my clients.
Please speak up when you answer the question.
Yeah.
Okay, I have a question regarding the efficacy of the policy. As I understand it, it's 4 grams, 10 grams are in 4 trees. However, when a tree is harvested, it typically yields more than 10 grams. So at that point, you'll be in possession of more than 10 grams. How is that? How will that be treated?
Well, that's an area, I guess, of difference in relation to the policy and in relation to what the Drug Advisory Council would have recommended. So, because the Drug Advisory Council recognizes that importation is not going to be allowed, it assumes that you have to get it from somewhere. And the assumption is that you're going to be growing it yourself. And if you're growing it yourself, then the other implied assumption is that you are given the scope to use by virtue of what you plant. Now, even though that is the case, it's not anticipating that you're going to be harvesting loads. It's the interpretation is that you're going to harvest what you need
Yeah.
for that particular purpose. You understand? So, are you suggesting that we reduce it to two or to one plant?
I'm saying I don't know if the 10 grams limit in your household is, I don't think that's necessary. Maybe 10 grams outside of your household, then that shows an intent to distribute. But 10 grams, because as you harvest a tree, you'll more than likely yield more than 10 grams. So you will have 10 grams in your possession at that point. So I don't know if that 10 gram limit within your household is necessary.
Gotcha.
I'm saying outside of the household.
Okay, gotcha. Understood.
Okay, so I have a question. So the question is, would it be possible to acquire seeds through e-commerce to plant for personal use? Like,
So what?
Is it possible to acquire seeds like offline, like order them offline? Would it be possible? No.
Because you'll have to, I'm assuming if you're acquiring seeds from overseas, you're importing them.
Oh, okay.
So the question that was asked was, can you like order seeds from online? Because if you're allowed to grow 4 plants, then can you acquire seeds from online? The assumption is if you're acquiring seeds from online, that means that you're importing them into the country. We're still not allowed under this framework to import. So unfortunately, I know that there are a lot of persons who've been asking about that, but that's not permitted.
I was wondering, will there be a way to regulate the quality and distribution of cannabis in Anguilla?
So, great question. So, part of why we're going with this unenforcement policy is first and foremost to understand the use. This is data. And the data will then lead us to the point of the regulations that the governor can make. Now, very key is distribution and quality control are all part of a licensing regime. And a licensing regime comes under the legislation and the legislative framework that we have. That's not where we are right now. So first and foremost, we're looking at removing the non-enforcement of the criminal sanction. Then we look at the data. Then we look at, okay, the quality of the cannabis plant, etc., under the Drugs Prevention of Misuse Act. So all of that gives the governor the power to look at the licensing specifically, the quality as well, those quality issues. But those quality issues can in a roundabout way be addressed under a current regime, under the Drugs Advisory Council. So the Drugs Advisory Council does have the power to look into things like, okay, well, there's a quality issue, or this is something that's coming up in terms of people are saying that there's not just cannabis alone in what persons are using. There's something else that can be flagged as an issue. But if it is flagged as an issue, that means that the Drugs Advisory Council can change their recommendation. I want you to hear this. If it is flagged that there's a concern in relation to the use or the quality of the cannabis, so let's just say in the US, they have an issue with fentanyl fentanyl, right?
Yeah, fentanyl.
If there is found to be like an issue of that nature, they can change their recommendation to the governor in relation to cannabis. They can change it. They can say, after finding this, our recommendation is actually to roll back. That's a possibility. So if there's concern, if there's a concern and there's a widespread issue, the Drugs Advisory Council can change their recommendations to the governor.
What kind of data will you be collecting, and how will you collect the data?
Okay. So because the interventions are police and user related, the police would ask anonymous. This data is going to be anonymized, by the way. This is anonymous data. They ask you who you are, what your age is, because that's part of the reason why we're trying to find out more. Who are you? What your age is? Are you a habitual user? Things of that nature. So you will be asked your age because that's part of us understanding the usage in Anguilla. And
So that's how you'll collect it, and what you'll be collecting. But so just solely ask from police officers surveying. That's the only method you'll be collecting data.
Yes.
Just police survey.
yes, what we plan on doing, and the Drugs Advisory Council plan on putting out a survey into the school system specifically, across the school system, and that survey will give more data in terms of persons in our institutions. So
That's where most. It's actually a stupid question. Never mind.
I don't know.
No question is a stupid question, but I want to ask you.
No, I understand.
Do you think most of the people you'll be surveying then are from school? So the rest will be
It'll be
police
wide.
officers asking.
There'll be a wide whole demographic of people. It's not necessarily just persons under 18, over 18 as well. You'd want to survey and understand usage in that age bracket as well. There are persons even beyond. So, for instance, like I said earlier, one of the demographics that have been reaching out to me quite a lot are older persons who have chronic pain, who want the access to CBD products for pain management. So
Who makes up the Drug Advisory Board?
So the Drug Advisory Board I'll actually put it up because I don't want to. Okay. So the Drug Advisory Council is made up of persons from psych. How do you say it? I don't have it here. This provision that I have screenshot doesn't show the makeup, but the makeup from what I recall relates to someone in the medical field. So someone who's a doctor, someone who is a psychosocial, someone in the psychosocial field. So whether or not that's a clinical psychologist or someone of that nature. There's someone who is in the nursing and pharmaceuticals field. So there's pharmaceuticals, there's clinical psychology, there is a doctor. There's someone from the United Kingdom who was a part of the UK Decrim advisory team, who also was a part of our Drug Advisory Council, and there's a lawyer. So we have those skill sets in the Drug Advisory Council.
Is it possible to get a national youth ambassador to also sit, just to represent the youth voice, since a lot of drug users are younger persons? just to make sure that we are, treated fairly throughout the process.
I can look into it, but I can say that at the moment it may be limited by what the legislation provides. So the legislation, I think, is actually quite specific in who can sit on the Drug Advisory Council, and they are appointed not by me, but by the governor. So that may be a little challenging, but I can look into it.
Thank you.
Hello. From what I heard earlier when you were talking about like a license to sell and quality control and all of that, I understand that aspect is very important as it relates to the health of people using marijuana coming like in Anguilla. And so in the future, with the decriminalization of the usage of, well, possession of 10 grams, will there be decriminalization of the selling of? And then on top of that, like to get a license and all of that, will there be regulations on like how much sold, how much grown, etc., etc.?
Okay. What I'll do to make it like to help color it is that in section 9, if you look at, I have it here. I'll send it over to you guys.
Oh, it's drafted.
There's a drafted section.
Okay, great.
And it relates to exempting certain things from the prohibition. So, and then it also deals with the licensing issued by the governor. So the governor can, under the legislation, when we get to the point of regulations, issue limited licensing for specific things. Limited. But as I said, you talked about quality control and things of that nature. The power that the Drug Advisory Committee council has, is to make recommendations and say, based on what we found, based on the data, this is what we will then recommend. These are the changes we would recommend to you as a governor, etc., based on what we've seen on island. So that's what the position is. So if there's an issue specifically you think with quality control and things of that nature, and then that leaves it up to whether or not you want to change that non-enforcement policy, or you want to create, or it's not just change the non-enforcement policy, but whether or not you want to create an additional intervention. So right now, the particular intervention is drugs counseling, but whether or not you want a wider intervention, that's also possible.
Right, so you already answered the first part of my question with what are some areas or some social spheres are you guys going to be targeting to collect some local information? The second part was from these, like assumably from these data findings, will there be strategies put in place to attack more vulnerable social groups when it comes to rehabilitation? Because of the general information that's around marijuana use, especially like in young adults, when it comes to cases of psychosis or cases of mental duress, are there going to be more strategies to target those groups as well, as we find it more commonplace in society?
Yeah, so that's exactly why, and I want to share that that's exactly why this isn't as what we said. This is what we said, a baby step. This is a baby step because we need to understand before we can say, and we can allow something to become like really widespread. We want to be able to take control baby steps. And so after we get that information and that data, that will allow us to have an informed perspective to make targeted interventions, because it's very difficult to make targeted interventions if you don't know what use looks like. So that's why we're doing what we're doing.
Great. That's good to know.
Yeah.
Well, first let me say that I think this is a very, very progressive move forward for Anguilla, one that's been a long time coming. And I want to thank both you and the administration for seeing the importance as it relates to really pushing and moving this thing forward. With that being said, marijuana, of course, is a product of, as my father would say, the ganja plant. But there are a number of products that come from this plant that are not necessarily the bud. For example, hemp. For example, CDB. How does those products play into now the fact that there's a little bit of a removed stigma amongst the plant itself, perhaps venturing into the production and manufacturing of that aspect of said plant?
Yeah. So I think the challenging thing has always been that decriminalizing it doesn't take it where we aspirationally want it to be in terms of industry, right? Because industry is dealing with the byproducts, it's dealing with the packaging, the products, and the potential export. It doesn't have to be export, but the potential for export. We're not at that point right now. And although we see, and if you could go to Miami, you could go to anywhere, and you'll see like the stores, and they'll have like CDB oils for joint pain and things of that nature. We're not there. And that's part of the limitation of this particular policy. When people have asked what are the limitations, that's the limit. This policy is not that way. Even though we can appreciate and we understand that there are wider uses of the plant itself. It's not just used for smoking. Very often there are other uses attached to it. People who use it for tea, people who use it for pain relief. There are wider uses, but in this particular instance, our focus is on removing the criminal stigma attached to it.
And I think this was covered a little bit earlier, but I didn't hear it perfectly, so I'm just gonna, ask one more time.
Yeah.
But as it relates to individuals who would have previously had some level of a record as it relates to cannabis possession or use under the 10 grams, will this affect them? As in, will this retroactively bring remove charges from? So it won't affect them retroactively.
No. What will affect them is the Rehabilitation of Offenders Act. That's what will affect them, and that's what we're currently working on.
So just to follow up on Jibril's question, is there any ideas or decision-making process in terms of reparations for some of the people who have been particularly affected by the previous policies?
I haven't thought about that yet.
Specifically, again, the Rastafari community.
I haven't thought about that yet, but thank you for putting it on my radar. That is something we can look into. I'm not sure what the answer is right now, but that is something we can look into. So I just wanted to kind of like go back into something that people were asking before, just for all of the persons who recently came, to give you some context. We're talking, a couple of you, we're talking about two aspects of there's legalization, as we talked about earlier, and then there's decriminalization, and then there's two ways of looking at decriminalization. There's de facto and there's de jure or de jure decriminalization. De jure means there is amendment to the legislative framework. De facto means there is an non-enforcement approach taken. So in Anguilla's case, we're doing the de facto decriminalization, which is the non-enforcement. I hope you understand. Yeah. So there are two types of decriminalization. And as I said, I will share that report on the City of Lambeth in the UK when they did their exercise. So you can look at it, you can peruse, and you can raise any concerns, because that report also did raise other areas, other things that they found afterwards, which you can chew over and see if that's something that you want to raise as well.
Are there any more final questions? Time is soon up. Any questions from the back?
Going once,
Going
going
twice?
twice.
I think.
So,
Any last things you would like to? Oh,
Bahani, you're on it. What's up?
Now I just want to say personally, to echo Jibri's words, I do congratulate the administration in this very progressive step. I look forward to the future steps that were mentioned, and I look forward to seeing where this change continue to push forward.
Thank you. My final words. Can I do final words? Wrap it up.
we'd like to thank you, Minister Deanne Kentish Rogers. Of course, we're going to leave you to some closing, but the National Youth Ambassador Corps is really appreciative of you giving this opportunity to young persons to be able to come out here, ask questions in spaces that we use, and giving us your time. We really do appreciate that. Hopefully, we can do more work with you in the future and other different policies, legislations that the government have in place coming up. Thank you.
I wanna thank everyone for taking the time to come out. I mean, I'm sure it's Friday night. People have better things to do or more fun events to go to. But I really want to thank you guys for taking the time to listen, to ask your questions, and judge for yourselves whether or not the answers answer your questions. Like Tashawn said, I hope you left with more answers and questions. And if you did leave with more questions, then please feel free to send me an email, send me a WhatsApp. It's open. These things are not stagnant. They're subject to change, and we like to keep an open door so that you can express how you feel about these things. This has been a long time in the progress, long time in the pipeline, but things do take time. Government processes are notoriously slow. But we endeavor as much as possible to strike a balance wherever we change and create policy. And I hope that you continue to stay engaged with all of the policy decisions, whether or not it's something interesting like cannabis or something more boring in the future. I do hope that you stay engaged and you engage with all of these policies in the future. So I want to thank you for taking your time out.
Oh, well, I do have one more question came in last minute.
Okay.
Would there be counseling for persons who want to be able to get off the drug use? Are recommended to do it? So there will be increased counselors?
Yeah. We spoke to that's one of the conversations we're having with the drugs counselor about how do we manage for persons in the wider community because that drugs counselor is specifically for persons under the age of 18. But then there's, for persons who actively see, let's just say, through the educational material, they're like, I may have a little bit of a problem. To be able to engage and say, well, I want to see someone and understand how I can change this pattern of behavior to a more healthy pattern of behavior. Yeah?
Thank you once again. We also like to thank Clean Stream, Waves as well for giving us this opportunity, the Department of Youth and Culture, and the government of Anguilla. Everyone, please feel free to grab something to eat. We have a lot of food.
And to all the young people who didn't come out, you're missing some food.
Lots and lots of it.
Lots of food. So next time.